The topic for this debate is, does John 15 teach a loss of salvation? I take the position, no, it does not teach a loss of salvation. I believe in eternal security. I am OSAS, meaning, and more particularly, I'm free grace, which means the most consistent form of OSAS. Now, as we're going into this, I'm going to do a lot of simplifying, visualizing, and clarifying based on certain things that I had with Dan Chapa in my 25th debate with him on the same passage, John chapter 15. That's my goal for this. Okay, so here's the structure for today's debate. I'm going to give an introduction, some framing, go into the book context, zoom in a little bit to our passage, give a little bit of Ezekiel 15 as a literary backdrop. I'm going to show y'all a new chart that's designed specifically for the viewer of the debates in my channel. Y'all had complaints about previous charts that I made, and so me and Chris Morrison, who also debates and defends free grace, have developed a chart together through a conversation, multiple hour conversation, and we're testing that out in this debate. John 15, I'm going to go into about the argument and the exposition for that. Then I'm going to go into motifs that are in harmony with John 15. And then I'm going to give a conclusion, an invitation, or challenge. So the thing about to understand about this is that being that I'm in the negative, the minimum I have to do in this debate is say, no, this does not teach loss of salvation, because there's other alternatives that are viable to understand John chapter 15. And I can give you any view within free grace. Technically, I can give you any view within OSAS, but I'm going to do my best to narrow it to free grace. And the particular view that I'm going to be arguing today, my view currently, is that as to interpretation, John 15 is about Jesus and the apostles. This is the same view I took in my Dan Chapa debate. In other words, the topic of John 15 is not about the loss of salvation. It's about how to be useful to God, or the consequence of being useless. So going into the book context, as we zoom in, we can see here these different squares. So the highest one up says, in black, says the Gospel of John, the whole book context and purpose. I believe that the Gospel of John is possibly to teach believers about evangelism. Okay, then we get to John 2, and what we find here is that it says the people believe, but Jesus didn't entrust himself to them. I think this fits into the idea that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is narrowing down his, looking for his 12 disciples. Okay, his 12, that will be the 12 apostles. Then in John 6, it's narrowed down to the 12 whenever he started talking about drinking blood and eating. And of course, he meant it metaphorically for his death, but they freaked out. Then we get to John 13 through 17. And here, this is his farewell discourse. And Judas leaves the room. And so Jesus is talking to his the apostles there at that point. In John 15, Jesus is exhorting his apostles. Okay, he's comforting them. It's his final week before he goes to the cross. John 15, 1 through 3, within the chapter of John, focuses on spring training. And this is very important to understand. In spring training of a vine, Jesus said, I'm the vine and you're the branches. In spring training, there's no wood produced. That's going to be key in this debate, I believe. No wood is being produced there. Instead, pruning or cleansing occurs there. But in John 15:6, the passage that people that believe you can lose your salvation, and Calvinists also have a problem with, is actually talking about the fall harvest, when wood already exists at that point to be burned. Okay? And it's similar to Ezekiel chapter 15, which we'll go into detail about. So here's what I was talking about, the book context. Y'all saw it visualized. You can see that they believed, but he didn't entrust himself in there. John 6, the disciples withdrew. He says, we have believed. Peter says, we believed. And Jesus says, did not I chose you? Yet one of you is the devil. And then we go to John 13. He who has bathed need to only have his feet washed. There's a distinction there between bathing and feet washing. We'll come to that in a minute. But Jesus says they're not all clean. All right. In John 15:3, picking up on this idea of cleansing, he said, you are already clean because of the word which I've spoken to you. And then 15, continuing this idea that Jesus is entrusting his responsibility to the apostles as he's preparing for his departure. He says, no longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing. So this is about revelation here. But I've called you friends, for all things that I've heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you would go and bear fruit. So in my view, this is not talking about salvation. This is talking about being chosen to be an apostle, and that your fruit will remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. So it's talking about the provision for there. A lot of people want to jump to church age application here, and all scripture has secondary application. But I think if you jump to application too quick here, you can run into some false doctrine. But in John 15:26 and 27, it's talking about the Holy Spirit's ministry. When the Helper comes, who I will send to you from the Father, that is the Spirit of truth, because they're going to be getting revelation, who proceeds from the Father. He will testify about me. And listen here, and you will testify also because you have been with me from the beginning. We see this as clearly apostolic language. We see this in other places where one of the conditions for being an apostle was being with them from the beginning. Now, here's a chiastic structure that goes from chapter 13 to 17, narrowing down. And the center of it is where it says divine in the branches, teaching, producing a community of mutual love. Okay, so the purpose statement in chapter 15 is about joy. Now, here's what I was talking about earlier, that you could divide this passage up into the spring training time and the fall harvest time. And this is very important to understand the distinction in the metaphor or the allegory. Okay, here's a key paper that I interacted with in my Dan Chapa debate, and it's in the back of my mind as I'm talking about this. You can download this, it's free, evaluate it. Here was the conclusion of this, but I've already kind of visualized it, so it's not a problem there. But basically, he's saying that God was emphasizing, Jesus is emphasizing his care for them and all of that stuff. So let's go into this Ezekiel 15 backdrop to understand this a little bit better. Now, you see, I have Ezekiel 15, 1 through 8, color coded. And so the orange brownish color, that represents wood. The vine better, or any type of useful language, either for building or support, is green. And any language that refers to being useful for fire, okay, it's in red. And then in this purplish color, it describes what the fire is. Okay. So I'll go ahead and read this passage so you get the full implication of it. But let me just show you what I'm just describing to y'all. I put it in chart form like this. And so the woods are on the far column, the useful for building and support idea, and then the fire useful for burning only. And so you can start over here. 15:1. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, how is the wood of the vine better than any wood of a branch which is among the trees of the forest? So it's about usefulness. 3. Can wood be taken from it, or can men take a peg from it to make anything on which to hang any vessel? So there's the support idea. 4. If it has been put into the fire for fuel, and the fire has consumed both its ends and its middle part, has been charred. Notice it's not fully annihilated. It's still there. It's just charred. Is it then useful for anything? In other words, you don't use vine wood to build things or to support things. So how much it's going to get in a worse condition whenever it's gone through fire. Okay. And then it says in 5, behold, while it's intact, in other words, useful, it is not made into anything. How much less when the fire has consumed it and it's charred, can it still be made into anything? 6. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, as the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest, and then we go to the fire section, which I have given to the fire for fuel. And then we have a description of what the fire is. So have I given up the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So we're talking about covenant, divine discipline, temporal judgment, that idea there. And I set my face against them. He's displeased with them. Then it says, though they have come out of the fire, so this would be a previous affliction, trial, bondage, yet the fire will consume them. So we kind of got poetic justice. And we're going to find out what this fire is, okay? Then you would know that I'm the Lord, when I set my face against them. Thus, verse 8, thus I will make the land desolate. So this is what it's talking about, giving up the inhabitants in Jerusalem, making the land desolate, God not being pleased. And what's the reason? Because they have acted unfaithfully, declares the Lord. So this is a prophecy about faithfulness and unfaithfulness, but notice everything's about the wood not being useful, okay? That's very important as we take into consideration this relationship to John 15 later on. Now, here's the new chart that I've designed for y'all. So it's a 4A chart. You got actual, assigned, arrived, achieved. Actual stands for you're actually saved at the moment of belief, okay? Assigned refers to your responsibility, your accountability, your purpose in life. Arrived refers to the fact that at your death, rapture, or resurrection, you're going to get a glorified body. And then the achieved refers to your rewards, your rank, greater opportunities to serve Christ in the kingdom. Now, here's the thing to understand. Just as initial event, that first moment of belief, guarantees it's sufficient, it's enough for you to get a glorified body. That's what this arching thing is pointing to. It also sets into motion the process of sanctification in your assignment. And you can be in and out of fellowship. But here's the thing to understand. Unlike the person that believes to lose your salvation usually, the basis for getting a glorified body is not you continuing to be faithful in the process. The basis is that initial moment of belief when you trusted in the right saving object, person, promise, okay? Now you'll see below here that John 15, including the term abide, and in me in that context is in the assigned category. Got to keep that in mind in this debate. Okay, so now let's go into John 15, the argument and the exposition. Here's an overview of this section, okay? In this allegory, the fire of burning is not interpreted. In other words, it says the Father's the gardener. Jesus says, I'm the true vine. You are the branches. It never says what the fire of the burning is. And so we need to be careful in assigning meaning to things that the text doesn't assign to. Now, the Old Testament vine motif that exists in the Old Testament, like in Ezekiel 15, informs this text. But Jesus transforms this metaphor. He's doing something slightly different than even in the Old Testament. Now, here's the issue. That word true vine can be referred to, the vine, a singular vine, or it can actually be translated as the vineyard. So if it's vine, then the apostles are the branches. If it's vineyard, then each one of the apostles are vines. And the word for vine, the word for branch in Greek, and I'll give support for this, can be used for a vine as well. So here's the point, though. If we're going with the true vine idea, then the spring training idea I was talking about earlier versus the fall distinction is more significant, even though I think it works either way. Remember, John 15, 1 through 3 will refer to that spring training. John 15, 6 would refer to the fall, since that's the only time that wood could be burned. The discourse of John 13 through 17 is a key to interpretation. The Old Testament theology is also key, especially Ezekiel 15. Now, right here we see in John 15, as I've already talked about, there's rules for interpreting allegory. If the text doesn't assign a meaning to it, we need to be very careful and hold it as almost tentative as we're evaluating it, because there's rules for interpreting it. I've already dealt with the true vine thing. And here's the thing: if the I already said all that too. Uh, so if it is vineyard, then each apostle is a vine, and they're useful. They produce branches, in other words, fruit bearers, and there's still branches in the vineyard. And you could find out that the branch can refer to an entire vine in the Baylor Handbook whenever it's quoting Calgonus, which I actually have his book. Whenever I was preparing for Dan Chapa, I studied that. The true vine is Jesus, which means he's the best representative of Israel, the vine of the Old Testament. This means that there's a change from the Old Testament motif. Like I said, it informs, but Jesus transforms it. So here it is right here. Pon klema, here's Cargonis, has shown that the meaning of this noun changed in Proto-Neo-Hellenistic Greek, denoted no longer merely the branch or twig, but the whole plant, the vine itself. Okay, that's from the Baylor Handbook. All right. So sometimes in this discussion of John 15, translations differ about, does it mean every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away? The question is, take away from what? Does it mean take away as like prune off? Or does it mean take away meaning lift up, take away from the ground so that it can be propped up for photosynthesis, cleaning, and all of those things can occur? But the focus of John 15 is on fruit bearing, that you bear fruit, much fruit, more fruit, much fruit. In John 15:3, it says you are already clean because of the word which I've spoken to you. The word for clean can refer to washing off, or it can refer to pruning. But the thing is, we need to understand is, where was the word clean last used? Well, in John 13:10 and 11. For he knew the one who was betraying him, for this reason he said, not all of you are clean. This is where the passage made a distinction between bathe and feet washing, okay, versus a one-time bath you do whenever you, before you leave your house, and then you go wash your feet when you go to somebody else's house because your feet get crusty by wearing open-toe sandals. But another thing is that ritually speaking, a person's ministry would begin with a ritual bath, the baptism, and then there would be times they would go to the bronze laver like the priest or whatever, and there would be a continual cleansing aspect going on. See, traditionally, OSAS people view bathe, and I would say free grace, a lot of them refer to bathe referring to being in union at salvation. In other words, in the actual category. But feet washing, they would say, is communion, fellowship, service. But I argued in my debate with Dan Chapa that bathe meant introduction into a ministry, just like Jesus' baptism introduced him into his messianic ministry. And feet washing would be the same view that we're talking about, maintenance for service, that idea there. In John 13:10 and 11, I already talked about that. He says, you're clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason, it said, not all of you are clean. So what we see here from this is that Judas is not clean. And I take not clean to mean not useful as an apostle. See, the disciples at this time, the apostles at this time, are clean, meaning they're useful for ministry. The word has a cleansing effect. Okay, and this ties to the feet washing idea. In John 17:17, still part of this discourse, sanctify them in truth, your word is truth. John 17:8, supporting the idea that this is primarily focused on the apostles and the stewardship entrusted to them. For the word which you gave me, I have given to them, and they received them and truly understood that I came forth from you, and they believed that you sent me. John 17:12. Judas perished. And this is important because some translations say none of them have been lost except for the son of perdition. But if I remember right, in John 17:12, the Greek uses the word for perish there. So what it's referring to is perishing. We got to ask, perish from what? Well, it's from his position of being apostle, not salvation. Now, I don't believe Judas is saved, okay? But if a person wants to argue that Judas was saved and he lost his salvation, I would say, prove to me that he lost his salvation. I don't believe they can do it. The thing is that Judas was not clean. And by that, I mean not useful to God. We see this language with Paul later on about vessels of dishonor can cleanse themselves and become vessel of honor. Kind of that idea there. In other words, he was not a partner with Jesus, because I think that's what John 15 is about. Partners and participation. So Jesus is telling the apostles, abide in partnership with me, meaning yield to me, and he will abide in partnership with them, providing for them. Okay. The goal is to bear fruit by depending on Jesus. Apart from him, they cannot do anything, meaning they can't be fruitful, they can't be useful. Now, in this section in 15:7, we're going to be moving into where we got conditional sentences here. Okay. And this is very important to understand. We got to be very careful when we're dealing with conditional clauses because they show up in different ways. Did you know that the Davidic covenant had a condition in it? In 2 Samuel 7:14, it says this, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the son of men. So this is talking about the Davidic covenant, which refers to everyone that of the descendants of Judah that are on the throne of is sitting on the throne of David, and then also Jesus. But here's the thing. Jesus never committed sin. So this means this conditional clause result never occurred for him because Jesus never met the condition of being corrected by men. Now at the cross, there's a whole nother thing that we could talk about concerning there, but I'm talking about during his sinless life before the cross. So keep that in mind when you're understanding conditional statements. In addition to that, you'll hear SFT say something could be hypothetically possible, but not hypothetically real. In other words, what he means by that, it can happen in theory based on a set of assumptions, but it is not actually true or likely in reality. Okay, so that's another type of thing that one can evaluate a conditional statement with. Another thing to take into consideration is all prophecy has statements of comfort and judgment, blessing and cursing, if you will. And like Ezekiel 15 and John 15, it's prophecy. It's in allegory form, but it's prophecy. And so prophecy is a message of comfort to the faithful remnant, okay? But to the unfaithful, it's a message of judgment, okay? But sometimes the audience, of that particular audience at that time, is only made up of the faithful, which means the judgment does not occur on them. Because if it's a warning about divine discipline, but they're being faithful, then that's not going to affect them. Just like when Jesus never sinned, that idea there. So just because a conditional clause or conditional sentence or concept mentions a consequence doesn't necessarily mean the consequence is going to occur. Okay. Another thing is we can't rule out covenant language here, covenant violation and all of that. So let's summarize. Remember, when we're dealing with allegory, the fire of the burning is not interpreted. We need to be careful assigning meaning to things. The Old Testament motif informs the text, but Jesus transforms the metaphor. If Jesus is the true vine and not the vineyard, then the spring training fall distinction is more significant, even though I think it works either way. John 15:1-3 would refer to spring. John 15:6 will refer to the fall, since only wood occurs during that time. The discourse of John 13-17 is key to interpretation, and Old Testament theology is also key, especially Ezekiel 15. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the motifs that are in harmony with John 15. So at the top, you see these words, the motif of vines being useful for service during the theocracy and secondary application to the church. The original title I had was Be Useful or Be Chastised, Faithful and Fruitful, Experiential Sanctification. So basically how this works, we go to Genesis. Genesis is the prologue for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the New Testament. And what we see is before the fall, we see Adam and Eve being useful and fruitful and faithful, okay? After the fall, you still have this idea that it's related to service and faithfulness. We get to Deuteronomy 28 and we see the concept of divine discipline, the blessings and the cursings. The idea of who to serve, that language there. And so this is the backdrop behind all negative and positive imagery in the Bible. In Ezekiel 15, we have an example of national faithful and unfaithful people. Okay? It's at the national level. In John 15, as I'm saying, primarily the apostles, secondary application to the church. And this is even true for Hebrews 6, which I'll bring up in a minute, which uses similar language as Ezekiel 15 and John 15. And you even have vine language for the kingdom as well. Now, I've used this in my previous debates, but if you look at Genesis 3, cursed is the ground, both thorns and thistles. In the Septuagint, it uses the words, same words used in Hebrews 6:8, where it says that the ground is cursed and to be burned. We'll go into that passage in a second. So y'all probably have seen this chart before too. The green represents blessed produce. The blue represents blessed rain. The red represents cursed produce. And the brown represents cursed ground or no rain. Okay. Look at how this pattern works in Hebrews 6:7. For ground that drinks the rain, which often falls, I could have put the ground as brown, but anyway, for ground that drinks the rain, which often falls on it, so there's the blessed blue, brings forth vegetation useful, that idea of usefulness. To those whose sake it is also tilled, receives a blessing from God. So there's the green produce blessing. Watch what 6:8 does. But if it yields thorns and thistles, it is worthless, meaning not useful, and close to being cursed, divine judgment. And it ends up being burned. Okay. So here's the motif again. Ezekiel 15, be useful, faithful, and fruitful. In fact, this is the same thing that could be understood for James 2. Be useful, faithful, and fruitful. It's not about proof of salvation or how to maintain your salvation, but it's be useful, faithful, and fruitful. Romans 11, in my view, is be useful, faithful, and fruitful. Same thing for Hebrews 6, John 15, and even in the kingdom. So whenever I'm looking at the Old Testament as my backdrop, informing the New Testament, one of the passages that Jesus says underneath the Mosaic Law, but written during the church age, is John 17:3. So I take eternal life as primarily qualitative, okay? And then we see that God is the perfect parent that brings divine discipline and blessings and curses. That's Deuteronomy 38. I set before you life and death, the blessing and cursing, in Deuteronomy 30:15 and 19. So when you see language like life and death or something similar to that, you should ask what type of blessing, what type of cursing is in view. And this is the backdrop for every encouragement passage, every warning passage. And as you see at the top, also the vine imagery. Okay, so all of this is factoring in here. All right, so concerning the conclusion, the invitation, and the challenge, remember, I just have to provide alternative explanations. I've given my free grace position that it's referring to the apostles being useful and dependent on him, that the fire is just a metaphor for uselessness. And then there's other options within free grace, but I don't have to go into those, okay? Now, my opponent sent me an outline, so I kind of have an idea about the direction he went into. He studied my videos and all of that. And so the issue is that he's going to attempt to bring up emunah, okay, this word for faithfulness, the Hebrew. And he's going to try to connect emunah to the other Greek words in the New Testament. And then he's going to try to argue that faithfulness means abiding. And then he's going to argue that salvation is dependent on your faithfulness or your abiding. Now, I could go into all the language stuff, but the reality is, if he wanted to debate languages, he should have said, hey, are you willing to debate me on the meaning of biblical faith? Okay, or something like that. But the battleground has been John 15, and so I hope my opponent stays there. My challenge is for my opponent to interact with John 15. God bless, guys. There's some more resources if I need it. But yeah. All right.